Hello everybody, and welcome to another session of AFTA's Fresh Take Friday webinar series. I'm your host, Carrie Rigdon, and today we're going to be learning about addressing the economic and public health threats of fraud. We've got an excellent speaker with us today, but first, a little housekeeping. So first, you probably noticed the session is being recorded for all those registered, and you will receive a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck in the next few days. If you have any questions for our speaker, please leave them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those during the question and answer portion at the end of the session. We ask that you use that Q&A box. The chat is still open, but for questions specifically, if you use the Q&A box, that really helps us see your questions and can address those. Also, if you'd like to ask a clarifying question during the presentation or when we get to the Q&A session, feel free to use that raise hand feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen and we'll prompt you to unmute. Lastly, I'd like to remind participants that the views and opinions expressed during this virtual event are those of the presenter and not necessarily of the Association of Food and Drug Officials. Participation in the virtual event does not necessarily constitute an endorsement of the speaker's views, products, or services. And this virtual event cannot be used to train AI models. So with that, now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Karen Everstein is the Technical Director in Regulatory Intelligence at Food Chain ID, where she leads a food fraud prevention program and helps clients conduct and document risk assessments to ensure food safety and brand protection. Dr. Everstein completed her degrees in public health at the University of Minnesota, where she received a Department of Homeland Security Center development grant. And she's also a member of the Journal of Food Protection editorial board and has served as chair of the IAFP Food Fraud Professional Development Group for the 2019 through 21 cycle. She's also co-edited the book Food Fraud, A Global Threat with Public Health and Economic Consequences. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Everstein.
Okay, hi everyone. Good morning. Apologies for the technical glitch at the beginning. We were all set and then I seem to have lost my connection. So today we are talking about food fraud, topic that I have worked on for quite a few years now. So just for a little bit of background, I am with a company called Food Chain ID. We have locations all over the globe. We work in many areas that support the food industry. So a lot of auditing to various standards, a lot of the GFSI standards, organic, non-GMO, some sustainability standards. We work in testing. We work in regulatory compliance, understanding food additives, food contaminants, vet drugs, pesticides, pesticide MRLs, a lot of areas. I work in commodity safety. So this is where we have kind of tools and consulting programs to support food safety. And obviously, I work heavily in the area of food authenticity. So today we'll talk about just some of the definitions around food fraud, some background. We'll talk about vulnerability assessments and mitigation strategies against food fraud, and also what can be done in times of uncertainty, such as now. It's actually seems like really everything for the past 5 to 6 years has felt pretty uncertain. This isn't exactly, we won't exactly talk about everything in this order, but broadly, this is what I plan to cover. So I actually used to work at the Minnesota Department of Health as a foodborne disease epidemiologist after I got my MPH, and knew Carrie there because she was at the Department of Agriculture. And I like to tell this story because I really feel like it in some ways sets the stage for a lot of what I've done in my career. So this was in 2007. There was an outbreak of Salmonella Wandsworth, wound up being associated with this product called Veggie Booty. At the time, I did not have a kid, although I have since had one, so very familiar with Veggie Booty. But the thing that really stuck with me, so this investigation happened, and it was obviously a nationwide investigation. And what wound up being the issue was this vegetable and spice powder that was imported from China. And we worked on a lot of outbreaks that happen in restaurants or at food production facilities that maybe made chicken. There was a large peanut paste outbreak kind of around this time. But this really stuck out to me because I remember thinking, like, we have this product that was very American seeming, and a lot of parents fed it to their young children, and it was kind of advertised as being healthy because it had this vegetable powder. And if you look at the ingredients, it just looks, I don't know, kind of healthy, I guess. Um, but so it kind of was interesting to me that it wound up being that this supplier imported this already mixed spice blend from China. And it occurred to me that I really did not at that time know a lot about food supply chains and how they worked and how food kind of moved around and how ingredient labels were put together and all of that. So it just sticks with me as an interesting moment. And after this, I wound up going back to school to continue my education. And at that point, started focusing more on this area of food fraud, which is a very supply chain focused issue. So a lot of food fraud controls are supply chain controls. So that outbreak just sticks out to this day in my head, even though at this point it was so many years ago. So a few years later, we were looking at something that happened. This was also in the mid 2000s, but this was more in the UK. And this involved Sudan dye adulteration of chili powder. The details don't matter, but at the time, they had um, published lists of the various suppliers and the various final food products that had to be recalled, and we mapped them. And so the point here is that one lot of chili powder, you can see it kind of starting in the upper left-hand corner, one of those black dots, exploded into this just fireworks of what had to be recalled. In the end, when they figured out that there was Sudan 1 in this chili powder that wound up in Worcestershire sauce, and that wound up in more than 600 finished food products. So just again, the issue of kind of the complexity of supply chains, and just kind of how interesting how food moves through the world, I guess. So, um, right. So food fraud definitions. I will not read all of these to you. Suffice it to say, there are many definitions of food fraud, or what the US FDA likes to call economically motivated adulteration. People like to argue about the definitions or say that we need to have aligned definitions, or we need to be talking about the same thing, which is true, I think. But the bottom line, I think, from my perspective and from the perspective of a lot of people, is if what you are selling is not what it proclaims to be, so this is in business to business transactions or to a consumer final point of sale, that to me is food fraud. Economically motivated. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, different from what I would call food defense or intentional adulteration. So in my mind, not everybody agrees with this, but food fraud is by definition motivated by economics, which is important because people are trying to have it not be detected, because otherwise then you're not making the extra money. So very different kind of framework for looking at adulteration. The FDA Food Safety Modernization Act wrote in some language about food fraud in FSMA a number of years ago. So they, heavily talked about hazard identification and hazard analysis. And, that is supposed to include things that could be introduced for the purposes of economic gain, focusing on cases where there's been a pattern of EMA in the past. So you could argue somewhat limited language related to EMA is in the Food Safety Modernization Act, although I don't like to speak on behalf of FDA because obviously I'm not with FDA. So if there's any FDA people on the call, please feel free to correct me. And I believe I've seen them say this at conferences before. So it seems like the language in FSMA is very limited with respect to EMA or food fraud. But if you go back and look at the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, I think FDA would argue it is covered. Kind of all aspects of EMA, including those that would be a potential hazard, are already covered in the FD&C. And so the FSMA language was specific to really focusing on that food safety piece. But anyway, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of FDA, but that's just the impression I've gotten, is that it's not that they only care about food fraud that could be hazardous. It's that the FD&C really covers kind of all EMA, and FSMA was additional language to that. So I borrowed this content from BD Food Safety Consultants that I did a joint webinar with last year sometime because I thought he had laid it out really nicely. But basically, FDA expects that PCQIs, preventive controls qualified individuals, will develop food safety plans, including recognizing the potential for hazards that could be because of food fraud or EMA. They have to collect information about those potential food safety hazards. And if they determine that they are likely to occur then or significant, then they may require preventive controls. And this requirement is supposed to be verified during routine inspections. Now, if you look at the Global Food Safety Initiative requirements, which apply to, I don't know what percent, but a huge percentage of food producers in the country, if not in the world, they are more, I don't know, prescriptive, I guess. They're broader in what they require from a food fraud prevention perspective. And they really do explicitly cover everything, not just things that could be hazards. So any kind of, again, I'm not going to read all this to you, but you can see they really want you to be, if you are a food producer, looking at a lot of different aspects, a lot of factors that could affect the incentive for fraud, economic factors, ease of access, things like that, and is also looking at various types of fraud, mislabeling, dilution, counterfeiting, etc. So pretty broad. In terms of what drove these requirements, so again, I am owning up to my age here, but melamine happened back in 2000. Well, there was melamine in pet food in 2007, and then followed up by melamine in milk products, primarily infant formula in 2008 in China, which was a huge deal at the time. And it still is funny to me when I talk to I guess younger audiences that don't necessarily remember this, but it was a very big deal and it really drove a lot of what happened here in the US. In 2013, I believe it was, horse meat happened, where there was horse meat in products that were supposed to be ground beef. I believe there was one lasagna product that really didn't have any beef in it. It was 100% horse meat, even though it was labeled as beef. So that really drove a lot of what happened in the UK and in Europe. So in 2014, the Elliott Review was published. And so this was Chris Elliott out of Queen's University in Belfast. And this was also a very, very big deal. And he really outlined a lot of the gaps in food supply chains and what could be done to prevent this happening in the future. And there has been a lot of activity over the past 10, 11 years in the UK and in Europe more broadly related to food fraud. So back to this question of what food fraud is. So this is, I'm sure you've seen this. Everybody likes to show this Venn diagram. So I'm showing it to you again. GFSI created it, but it kind of shows that, the side intentional versus unintentional. So you kind of have food quality and food safety issues on the unintentional side, and food fraud and food defense, or what I think of as food defense, but things that are where you're really trying to make people sick, that's on the intentional side. And it really looks like food fraud and food defense would be addressed in a similar way because they're both on the intentional side. But I really think the approach to them is very different because, again, in the case of food fraud, people do not want to be detected because they want to make that extra money. If food defense, if it's ideologically driven, if you are trying to cause harm to whoever, people, your company, a whole industry, that will immediately be detected because people will immediately become sick or injured, whereas food fraud is not. So I just think the entire way that you think about it and think about risk assessments and all of that is very different, even though they seem to sit kind of on the same side of this line. So again, when I think of food fraud, I am not thinking at all of ideologically driven motivation to make people sick. It's really in my mind the economically driven adulteration that nobody wants to be detected because then you've kind of lost your extra income, I guess. So I had created this slide for something else. I just threw it in here as an example of a true food defense issue. This happened in Australia, and it just involved needles in strawberries. but really caused a lot of damage to the industry. But these cases are extremely rare. They really are very, very rare. And food fraud is just not rare at all. I don't even know if I mean, it's one of those situations where it's the iceberg and the bit of the iceberg that's above water that we're aware of. So I don't think we know the true scope of food fraud, but anyway, these true food defense incidents are pretty rare. So I just pulled up some recent food fraud incidents from around the world. In the UK, the FSA, the Food Standards, I'm forgetting what it stands for. Food Standards Agency of the UK, I believe, I might have that wrong, released a report warning about additives in saffron, specifically food colors. Alcoholic beverages is a big issue, especially alcohol that's produced either unregulated or in kind of informal markets containing methanol. That can be a deadly issue. Turkey, interestingly, has over the past, I don't know what it's been, maybe the past year, they've started publicly releasing a lot of information on food safety and food fraud issues in the country. And horse meat is something that they've reported on, or that's kind of come out through that mechanism a lot, which I'm finding really interesting. India does a lot of reporting. Most of that is the Turkey reporting is from the regulators. The reporting that comes out of India, a lot of it is media reports and things like that. But it's just a lot of issues with dairy products. USDA, I actually don't know if they are, I mean, obviously they're not currently doing this with the shutdown, but I don't even know if they're still doing it in general. I hope that they are. They put out lists of organic producers or organic products that have fraudulent organic certificates. And that's kind of an interesting thing to look through because it happens more often than, I guess more often than you would think. They did institute additional protections in the past couple of years. And those numbers seem to have come down a little bit, but I hope that they still do that. Honey, obviously a huge, huge challenge globally because it's sold as a commodity. Testing methods for honey are just really complicated. You wouldn't expect them to be that complicated. I'm not an analytical chemist, but I listen to a lot of discussions of honey and its complications, and it's really interesting. And there was recently one in the USDA where a producer was using false, sorry, did I just say in the USDA? In the US, where a producer was using false USDA marks of inspection. So again, not a rare problem. So the question is, what is the scope of food fraud globally? And spoiler alert, I'm just checking the time so I don't talk over my time. We don't know. I honestly don't think anybody knows. We try to track food fraud and we have a database, and you can see here the number of records we captured over the past few years. There's always a lag with our data collection, the type of data we're collecting and how we collect it. The 2025 numbers won't be kind of almost complete until, I don't know, sometime in the first few months of 2026. But you can see last year in 2024, we captured more than 800 records. But a lot of this is just dependent on what the data is you're looking at, how you're capturing it, and all of that. If you're interested, the Food Authenticity Network, they are out of the UK. They do a project to put out a report every year looking at 3 data sources. Ours is one of them. Fair Horizon Scan and Mary Nutrasciences has a data system called Safety HUD. They kind of look at those all together and put out a report. The 2 other data sources that are not ours look primarily at official reports. They look beyond that, but most of what they capture is official reports, and that's kind of what the Food Authenticity Network focuses on. But my point here, they average them together, which is a long story why. But anyway, what you're looking at here is an average of the data from Horizon Scan and the MaryU system. But if you count up 2 things, you can see that the food fraud reports are a small fraction of all of the food safety reports or all the reports they're looking at. But also, if you add up the 4 quarters of the food fraud reports, you get about double what we had. It's over 1,600. Multiple reasons for this. Official reports if you think back to something like ethylene oxide from a few years ago, there was literally hundreds of reports coming through because you have all the different regulators that are putting out alerts and all of that. So we try to avoid double counting in our information. We can't always do it, but we try to the best of our ability to do that. So point being, it's really hard to get true numbers on fraud, and it's hard to align between systems because the data collection and the data standardization and all that's just very different between among all the systems. But FAN, the Food Authenticity Network, has tried to put out information to kind of bring it all together. And this is publicly available. So at the link at the bottom, you can just go to that URL and get this whole report if you are interested. And again, if you look across data systems about the information they're collecting on food fraud, you can see not a ton of alignment. It's just true. It's just the way it is. So it's hard to have a definitive sense of exactly where the risk is, I would say, at any given time globally. But people are doing their best to get that information out there. So in terms of what we look at, we try to pull together as wide a variety of data as we can. So certainly looking at regulatory information, but also looking at scientific publications, these samples that are done, or wide scale kind of sampling projects that are done, media reports, obviously with caveats. So the idea here is that we just want to pull together as much information as we can to help people understand what potential food fraud risks might be. And if we look across our system, this is looking at the 10 years ending last year. It's pretty consistent, I would say. The top four you'll see in this chart are seafood, dairy, meat and poultry, and herbs and spices. Honey, I guess, followed as a close fifth, but those account for really more than half of the records that we have collected. One of the things I do want to say is that dairy, I was giving a talk one time, and I don't know if it was the Dairy Farmers of America, a big dairy group in the US was in the audience. And the guy stood up and was like, "We don't have these issues with dairy in the US. Can you please make that clear?" And it's true. Our dairy system is very highly regulated. Most of the dairy records that we have are from other countries that might have more informal, locally, local small dairy markets. Ours is very highly consolidated, obviously, and very highly regulated. So I feel like I always have to put in that little disclaimer when I talk about dairy. The other thing I like to mention is we do look at the adulterants. So when we are collecting data, we're looking at what the raw material or what the food product is or is supposed to be, and what the thing is in that product that's not supposed to be there, and whether that might be potentially hazardous. So when you look across all of our data, it is more than 50% of adulterants might be potentially hazardous. And this is for a number of reasons you can see on the screen. The reason I don't say almost 60% is if you have a milk product that's substituted for a milk product, it's still a milk product, which is an allergen. So that's going to show up as potentially hazardous, even though, let's say, both products were originally milk products. I hope that makes sense. So there's a little bit of, because of the way we collect the data, it's a slightly inflated number. But I still think it's important to note that food fraud is not just innocuous. It's not only for economic gain. Obviously, mistakes do happen and people do get sick. It also does happen at retail. So primarily what we're looking at is supply chain data for food producers and that kind of information, but it certainly is something that happens at retail. This is over the past few years. I just pulled some examples. So in Rome, they did a big look at olive oil that was sold at restaurants, like right in the middle of the city. And it just seemed like that was something that a lot of restaurants were doing, was kind of dyeing the olive oil or dyeing vegetable oils and calling them olive oil. I'm guessing it's probably just those things that sit on the table. They looked at those sushi restaurants in Taiwan where the sushi kind of goes around the little like train thing, which I was at one of those once. It was very, very cool. But there's some species problems with that sushi. In Florida, they certainly have issues with fish. I think grouper's big there. So having issues with mislabeling of fish and just other issues at restaurants, kind of labeling things as humanely raised grass-fed, organic, all of that. So certainly can be an issue at retail, and it's just hard, I'm guessing, to do that kind of testing. I mean, authenticity testing is hard. It's very hard once something is in a multi-component finished product. So, all right. Impacts of food fraud incidents. Obviously, they can be many and varied. They can cause a lot of problems. So what happened recently with lead in cinnamon applesauce pouches, there's more than 500 kids with some kind of lead poisoning or elevated lead levels. Again, adulterated liquors. Those, I mean, people die from that all the time around the world, which is, unfortunate and scary. Consumer distrust. When the melamine scandal happened in China, consumers in China bought foreign brands of infant formula for years. I mean, it was like the tail of the results of that just lasted for years and years. So there can be really big effects. This was just an article that I pulled. Oh yeah, it was in the Harvard International Review. I guess the citation's at the bottom. Just talking about how fraud can just cause distrust in industry among consumers. So it really is something, aside from kind of the public health argument of it and the regulator argument of it, it really is something that large food companies do want to prevent. And a lot of them work very hard on it. Environmental effects. Again, honey is a huge one. I mean, if we don't have honeybees, that's a big problem. So when you have fraud in honey and when it looks like our honey supplies are fine and honey is sold at a very low price, beekeepers cannot support themselves. And so producers of legitimate honey that is not, that meets the standards and isn't cut with other sugar syrups suffer. And then honeybees suffer, and really our whole agricultural system suffers. So it goes beyond just kind of immediate public health effects, I guess. And this was a paper on the left-hand side where they just were estimating food waste based on, I guess this was actually, I just pulled this, I think, just to show the food waste issue, but so this looks like this was due to certain bacterial pathogens, but just interesting when people actually sit down and look at the numbers, the losses can be really large, and that's definitely a sustainability issue. And not to mention financial losses. So when PCA happens, that had a huge effect on the peanut industry. And I know we think of that as a food safety incident, which it certainly was, but it was also fraud because they were falsifying laboratory documents. So those peanuts never should have gone into production because they tested positive, but they put them into production anyway. So kind of a nice combination of food safety and food fraud issues there. And then obviously the Wana Bana went into Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which that was a fun fact. I didn't know the difference between Chapter 7 and Chapter 11 at the time, so it was interesting to read about. Just a little bit more about spices and specifically cinnamon, because I thought this was interesting. If you look at the FDA warning letter that they sent to the producer had said, or FDA said that the producer said lead was not identified as a hazard needing a preventive control because there were not historical precedents. So I think it's interesting, if you're doing a food fraud assessment, a vulnerability assessment, you're supposed to look at historical precedent. What is there, a historical precedent for, or what's known and reasonably foreseeable, maybe in FDA's language. But then you get into the semantics of what is historical precedent. Obviously, FDA said, well, you should have had a preventive control. I think that is a good argument to make. But one of the reasons we look heavily beyond regulatory alerts, and we really like to look a lot at the scientific literature, is there is historical precedent for almost everything. Truly. So this is a paper that was published in 2019 where they were looking at children, I guess children and adults in New York City that had elevated lead levels in their blood. And they tested spices. And if you look at this paper, they tested cinnamon, and the highest level of lead that they found in cinnamon was 880 ppm, which is astronomical, not as astronomical as the levels in uh, the lead in the cinnamon that went into the applesauce, but this is huge. I mean, this is not environmental contamination levels, which are, I don't, the American Spice Trade Association, I think they said what they call background levels, which are kind of under expectable environmental levels is 2 or 2.5 ppm. I might be off, but in that range of 2 to 3 maybe ppm. So 880 is crazy. Just huge level. So obviously this is something that was added. So it's like you kind of have to dig around to find what could be considered a historical precedent, but it is there a lot of times in the scientific literature. Even with something like melamine, there was papers published in the 1980s where they were looking at melamine adulteration of high protein products. That it was at that time, it was fish feed and some other kind of animal feed. So high protein products that go into animal feed, but they had melamine added to them to artificially inflate the perceived protein content. So it's kind of like everything is uh everything old is new or whatever that expression is. Everything new is old. I don't know. Um, so also turmeric. I just like to mention turmeric because I know turmeric is still kind of a trendy thing. Turmeric is has historically had really, really big issues with lead. I think they're working on it. There was a whole effort that happened in Bangladesh because what would happen is you'd have the turmeric root or the rhizome, I guess, and people would paint it with a lead containing pigment because it makes it look bright, nice and bright orange, and then it sells for a better price. And that was and it's not even like everybody is doing this maliciously. It's just the thing that happens. So if you want to compete in the marketplace, a similar thing happened with melamine in China, actually. So it's not like you have all these small producers that are like, oh, we're going to paint this with lead and people are going to get sick. They're just kind of doing what they have to do to compete in the marketplace. So there was a big push in Bangladesh a few years ago to really provide education on this practice and try to reduce it, which at the time there was another paper published on that. But I do like to mention turmeric just because I know people take it a lot of times and even as a supplement, not just as a food product. So it's a good one to make sure you're sourcing it from, a reputable source that is testing for heavy metals. So if we look across herbs and spices, I went down an herb and spice rabbit hole, I guess a little bit, but this is one of the areas, one of the commodities, I guess, where we see a lot of addition of non-food grade substances, like more than in other products. So it's definitely an area that's worth, taking care with what you're sourcing. All right, I know I have to finish up, Carrie. Food fraud prevention, there's various things to look at, but really it all comes down to kind of this balancing act of you have your supply chain controls, you have what's going on in the marketplace, you have your auditing program, what's the known history of fraud risk. Your testing program can help balance that, but it cannot be the entire thing. Like testing is expensive. It's not always effective, again, depending on what form things are in. And there's all the time, people that are committing fraud in food know what the testing programs are, the testing methods. And so they kind of design the fraud around that. So it's always this balancing act, and you can't just rely on testing. And most people don't want to do a lot of testing. So this is kind of how we approach what we do, is kind of pulling together all the relevant data and making sure it aligns to your raw materials. And we usually do a two-step process. If you source more than, I don't know, let's say 20 raw materials, again, if you are a food company, basically do a baseline risk, looking at historical data. And then for things for which there is historical data, go on and do a more in-depth assessment. So looking at your suppliers, your supplier relationship, your audit strategy, all of that. So you can kind of focus that really in-depth assessment that takes more time and resources on things that are known to have a higher risk. So now the situation we are in now, currently, we know that there's certain drivers of fraud risk shown on the screen there. So something like supply shortages. There's been a lot of supply shortages with olive oil recently, price increases, cocoa. I mean, cocoa prices have gone up a lot. Looks like they've come down slightly just recently, but they really have gone up a lot in the past few years. Transportation disruptions, I'll throw tariffs in there, and something like consumer demand. I have never had one of these, but there was these Dubai chocolate bars that have a lot of pistachios in them. I think we're causing some strain on the pistachio market for a little while. So we seem to be in a situation right now where these drivers of fraud risk are particularly elevated. And so it's a really good time to just make sure, as a food producer or as a regulator, you're kind of asking these questions. I read this article recently in the Atlantic. I just thought it was kind of fun. Uh, Not all shortages have to result in fraud. Obviously, if you are a large company and you are, you do not want to have an issue because it will affect your brand, you can reformulate or make new products that don't have as much, let's say, cocoa in them. This article was about Halloween candies and new Halloween candies that have less chocolate in them, like some of the ones shown on the screen here, which I thought was really interesting. So creative ways of putting less chocolate in something that is still a candy, uh, like all the 18 flavors of Kit Kats or whatever. So not all supply shortages have to result in fraud. So we do recommend looking at a lot of sources of data for your vulnerability assessments or your hazard analysis for EMA, however you're approaching it. And I think this is where I don't talk a lot about AI just because I don't feel like I'm an expert on AI, but certainly at least kind of machine learning can start to fit in here really nicely. So it's used right now a lot with a lot of laboratory methods that are done. So kind of getting your results and having some kind of chemometric model that is done through machine learning, identify which things, which are authentic perhaps and which are not. Um, Managing supplier data, it can fit into a lot of these pieces really nicely. So if you're managing a lot of data streams and you have a way to automate it more, that's great. I don't necessarily think we're at the point where AI is a magic ball that's going to predict the next food fraud event. I think for years we've been trying to get there. People want to get there. I don't think we're there yet. Again, also because people are doing this in very intentionally and knowing what they're doing. I'm going to finish up this though. We get the question a lot, why don't we just test everything at every point in the supply chain, I guess, which would be extremely challenging. I won't talk about this slide too much, but this is a presentation that a guy named John Points in the UK did a few years ago. It's posted on, looks like it's posted on his website. I think it might also be on YouTube. It's a really good discussion. He's a chemist, I believe, and he goes through why testing is so challenging for the food industry. So if you would like more information on that, that is a really interesting little talk about that question. How can consumers protect themselves from food fraud? There's just various ways to do it. I think it also goes for, companies. You should be skeptical if prices appear too good to be true. Be wary of trendy products, all of that. And then just two takeaways, two papers I really like. One is a white paper that was written by lawyers, so that might not be your thing, but I thought it was really interesting on the left-hand side. It's been a number of years now, but they really look at the history of food fraud and kind of the legal framework around it. And I like that paper a lot. And also the best information I've ever seen on what happened with melamine. Again, I'm dating myself here, but it was this conference paper that was presented by these two economists at this economist conference, which sounds very random, but it is super interesting. And it's truly the best discussion of what happened with melamine, like what actually happened that I've ever seen. And then I'll end with some resources that you can check out. Some are free, some are not free. I just threw them all on there. If you have any interest in food fraud or having discussions about it, we just had a food fraud IFP professional development group discussion meeting this morning for the food fraud PDG. Definitely join that. Angela Anandapa is leading that, and it's just a good group to have discussions. So, okay, I think I did okay on time, Carrie. I hope I did.
Yeah, no, we're all good on time. And
Okay, good.
thank you, Karen. That was fascinating. And for our audience members, please put just a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, Karen, I was actually really surprised. This is the uh, so one of the big things that I learned today was that distinction about the cinnamon and applesauce and FDA making that distinction of kind of historical regulatory precedents was absent because when that outbreak started and I saw the cinnamon and the cinnamon applesauce pouches, my immediate thought was, oh, well, it's quite likely going to be the cinnamon.
Yeah.
Um, but I really liked that point of reinforcing everybody should be casting a broad net on the information that they collect. And another just a comment I see in the chat by Thaddeus Bach had made when you were talking about at retail. Um, Thaddeus has said many sushi restaurants I have inspected have labeled escalar as white tuna. Is that even a
I
thing? Like, are people just restaurants just getting creative with names or?
That is definitely a thing. Yes, I love that comment. Yep, I have definitely seen that too. There's been quite a few papers actually published on that exact when they're looking at seafood species authenticity, they'd look at that exact issue. So you call it white tuna, which is not even a thing that technically exists. So yes, thank you for the comment. It's very true.
I thought that was great. And then Gail Prince had a question. What about dietary supplements from the standpoint of fraud? Do you have um, any
Yes.
insights on that?
Yes, and I'm sure Gail does too. So I don't know if he can talk. That is a huge area. I for years resisted. I mean, I'm a food person and I kind of resisted getting into the dietary supplement area, but there's so much overlap now. There's so many food products that have things that are supplement like things that the question is, I mean, there's just well, the thing that was just published by Consumer Reports about protein powders, and it's like, are those supplements, are those foods? They go into foods. Yes, it's a huge area with huge challenges. And one of the most interesting things I think is, and FDA puts out information on this a lot, the use of actual active pharmaceutical ingredients in things that are then sold as dietary supplements, which I thought didn't make any sense at all at first. So if you have things like, weight loss products or kind of male enhancement products, for lack of a better term, things like that, they'll actually put the actual active API in the product. I don't always understand exactly how that happens, but they just label it as, some supplement and it has the actual API in it. And so that is economically viable. It is a mystery to me about how that is, but yes, lots of challenges with dietary supplements.
Yeah, great, thanks. And then I like this question from Christy. Is there a website or somewhere to keep up with all these food fraud discoveries and investigations? Is that what
Yeah.
any resources out there you can share with us?
That's a great question. So the FDA's website, I put on that list of resources, but that one is a little bit more general. Definitely in in Europe, OPSON reports come out, the rapid alert system for food and feed. So that's not necessarily investigations. That's a little bit further beyond once the investigation has happened. I don't know how to keep on top of active investigations, but once things are reported, I would say definitely just all the FDA and USDA listservs or whatever you call them these days, the rapid alert system for food and feed in Europe, get on whatever their mailing list is for OPSON. If you want to email me, I can try to pull together all the stuff that we track. Honestly, Google Alerts can be helpful as well.
Hmm.
And then I could send you a list of like the various regulatory agencies that put out information if that's kind of what you're getting at is more on the regulatory side. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Gail, sorry, I just saw Gail's second comment.
So melamine showing up on the alert issue again. Have you noticed
Advice.
that? Yeah.
No, I mean, you see it a lot in food contact. So that's one of the issues we always have to tease out is it a food
Hmm.
contact situation with melamine dishware or is it actually melamine in something? And so I don't know exactly what he's talking about here. I mean, over the past whatever it's been, 18 years now or whatever it's been, there's been so much method development for melamine that it seems like it is a problem that should be detectable if people are still testing for it. Anyway, that's what I would say. So I don't know if I have specific advice. I'd have to see what he's talking about, but yeah, melamine, I mean, there's methods, all kinds of methods as an ingredient. Yeah, that's interesting, Gail. I had not seen that yet today. I'm glad you're still on top of all of that stuff.
Yeah. So, other questions. I don't see anything else in the chat or the Q&A. Um, but yes, and so you talk about scientific journals and reports, and I know you can set up alerts for things like that. Um, and I know sometimes the scientific community has different keywords, but would you
Yeah.
just recommend food fraud or economically motivated adulteration, or what are some of the terms that folks can use when they're looking through scientific
That
journals?
is a very good question because food fraud is not enough. So I'm trying to
Mm.
think, we have a team of analysts that's kind of looking at this stuff to pull together. Uh, and I'm trying to think through the keywords that we have. So sometimes if it's something like spices, we'll usually have the specific spice with all the things, right? The colors and the lead. So sometimes you might want to be a little bit more creative. So definitely food fraud, EMA, just the word adulteration or authenticity. So
Oh,
basil plus authenticity. And then you'll get a lot of those papers. A lot of them will be about methods, but sometimes along with method development, they'll do some testing and they'll find some fraud with that kind of testing in the marketplace that they do. So, yeah, that's what I would suggest. Definitely use the word authenticity or authentic, because then you'll get authentication and authenticity along with it.
nice.
But then if you can do individual keywords for commodities and any known adulterants or adulteration methods, that can be helpful too.
Great. All right. Well, I don't see any more open questions, so I'm going to bring things to a close. So thank you for participating in today's webinar and all your insightful questions. Um, Please look for a post-webinar email next week, which will include access to this recording as well as a PDF version of the presentation. And also join us for our next Fresh Take Friday presentation. That's going to be on October 24th when Rosa Stillwell is going to speak to us on oral culture training and food safety. So thanks again, and thanks, Karen. And yeah, everyone have a good rest of your day. Appreciate it. Thanks.